Rust is now in the kernel. Let's ignore any of the proposed benefits it may or may not bring into the future and answer a very simple question. Will there be Rust-free kernels? Yes. Thank you guys for watching. If you liked the video, I'm going to go and like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. Okay, wait, there is a lot more to it than that. Think of Rust in the Linux kernel as like a crack in a window, and right now that crack is this baby little chip that is really easy to fix. At a fairly high-level view, in the 6.1 Linux kernel, there is a very simple Rust environment. There is this very simple framework to ensure that Rust is going to function running with the kernel. It's basically the equivalent of a Hello World example. Currently, there is nothing important, no drivers written that rely on this Rust support. Following in the 6.2 release, there is going to be a lot more of a complete environment. It's still in its fairly experimental stage, but there's going to be more language bindings, data types, and everything else you need. It's going to be ready to start writing some of those early Rust drivers, but there's still not going to be anything shipped with the kernel that relies on this environment. Okay, so can we get rid of it then? Well, yes, we actually can, and it's easier to not have Rust in the kernel than it is to have Rust in the kernel. If you don't have Rust tooling currently available, or the Rust tooling you have is a little bit too out of date, the tooling for the kernel is going to automatically disable the Rust support so that everything can be compiled correctly. Right now, the Rust support is not required for anything, so not having it there isn't harmful whatsoever. It's basically only required to be there if you are trying to do some Rust kernel development, and if you're doing that, there is this whole setup guide required to get everything working like it really should be. But that's just right now in December of 2022. Let's skip ahead a bit by 6 months, a year, to the point where the crack has grown a little bit where you can see it, but it's not too big that it can't be fixed. Now there is certain hardware available that only have Rust drivers present or in some way or another heavily rely on Rust. Maybe it's a Wi-Fi driver, maybe it's for a Bluetooth dongle, or maybe the driver for the M1 GPU has been merged into the kernel. By this point, most of the distros out there are probably going to be compiling in Rust support to ensure these drivers are available for their users. But if systemd has taught us anything, there will always be protest distros that arise. You have things like Devuin and Artix, which literally just exist to be Debian and Arch minus systemd. You have the Libre distros like Parabola, which is Arch minus the proprietary software, but when we're talking about the mainline distros like your Ubuntu's, your Arches, Fedoras, Red Hat, you would expect the Rust drivers and the Rust support to just automatically be available. But there's nothing stopping you compiling your own kernel. Whether you want to or even can do so really depends on the hardware you are using. Like any other part of the kernel, it can be stripped out if you're not using it. A great example of this is the Linux Libre kernel, where all of the proprietary modules are gone. But with that, it doesn't work on a lot of the hardware out there. So if the drivers that you require are not relying on the Rust support and not written in Rust, you could go and do so just fine. By this point, maybe a year from now, there's probably not going to be that much hardware that uses it outside of specialized hardware like those M1 systems. But if you've got things to do and compiling the Linux kernel isn't for you, there's probably going to be projects that arise that deal with exactly this problem. A Linux Rustless project, you might say, where it's just shipping the Linux kernel with all of the Rust stuff stripped out, and then going forward, as more Rust things are brought in, it'll make sure those things are being removed. Now, the final stage may or may not happen. This is the point of no return. Rust is here, whether you like it or not. This crack has gone from being this little sliver in the window to spider webbing across the entire thing, and the only thing you can do is get a new window. core aspects of the kernel are now written in Rust, use Rust in some way, or have some connection to Rust being present. Maybe your memory management, the way paging works, mainline hardware from Intel, AMD, Nvidia, and companies like that, all in some way written in Rust or rely on Rust support being present. The reason I say may or may not happen is at this stage, Rust in the Linux kernel is still considered to be experimental. Besides the fact that it's still being worked on, it's unclear what the future Rust in the kernel is really going to be. You've never had Rust in the Linux kernel, no one's really sure exactly what problems it can address, what problems it can't address, whether it's even worth being in the kernel in the first place, but they're willing to experiment with it to see what problems it can actually address. Now, going all the way back to September, at the 2022 Linux Kernel Maintainers Summit, Torvalds was asked this: when would Rust become mandatory to build the kernel? And his answer was very simple: when the hardware he has requires it. If and when that point comes, it will be an indication that Rust is a success for kernel development. This point may never happen. We generally like to think of the Linux kernel as one project, but when you have thousands upon thousands of developers, tens of thousands of commits, every single release, and millions of lines, it's more like a bunch of smaller projects all managed under the banner of the kernel. You've got the memory people, you've got the graphics people, you've got all of these other different projects all trying to improve things in the kernel, but not necessarily operating in the exact same way. And it's up to these individual projects how much or how little they want to be using Rust. Some of them may never be using Rust, whereas others, like say the graphics side for example, if Mesa was anything to go by, is probably going to heavily use Rust. But at the end of the day, what's really important for me isn't whether Rust is or isn't in the kernel. What really matters is the end result going to be better or not. If adding Rust into the kernel is going to make things better, hey, go ahead and do so. And considering the amount of excitement from kernel developers and graphics developers and other people who actually know what they're talking about, it seems like there's at least something there, but we'll have to wait and see what the end result is really going to be. For all it matters, they could add Python into kernel development. If it made it better, hey, go ahead and do so. But let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. Maybe you just hate Rust and you are going to be one of those people trying to do a Rust-free kernel. Let me know why that might appeal to you. But for anybody else, I don't know, let me know what you're interested in about Rust or anything else. So if you like this video, I'm going to go and like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon, subscribe, selling Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie on Games. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.